His laughter sliced through the elegant hush of the restaurant, sharp and cruel. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. All eyes began to settle on the table, where a plainly dressed woman sat alone. Her black dress was simple, wrinkled from a long flight, and her hair hung in loose strands around her tired face. She looked out of place in the Sterling Room, a place known for hosting New York's elite, where reputation was measured not just by wealth, but by the flawless way one wore it. At a nearby table, Richard Harrington leaned back in his chair, smug and entertained. A man known for his power in the financial world, and even more for the way he enjoyed cutting people down in public. His voice, loud enough for others to hear, dripped with sarcasm. "Looks like someone got lost on the way to the diner down the street," he chuckled. His companions laughed on cue. The insult landed. That should have been the end of it. Usually it was, but this time, the woman didn't shrink. She didn't pretend not to hear. She didn't look away. Instead, she lifted her eyes and locked onto his with a calm that made the air shift. Her voice, soft but firm, sliced through the tension with quiet force. "Mock me again." Just 3 words. No anger, no fear, just a quiet warning. Richard had no idea who she was. No idea what those 3 words meant. He thought she was just another nobody to step on. But he was about to find out. He had picked the wrong woman. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to realize, too late, just how wrong you were? The Sterling Room wasn't just a restaurant. It was a declaration. A sanctuary for the powerful, the polished, the perfectly put together. Crystal chandeliers floated above tables draped in imported linens, casting a warm, flattering glow over the city's elite. Every table was adorned with a single white orchid, its delicate petals mirroring the fragile egos of those who dined beneath them. Here, reputations are not just preserved, they were built, displayed, and worshipped. To enter the Sterling Room was to announce that you belonged, that you had made it. And that made Margaret Walker's entrance all the more jarring. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, drawing curious glances the moment she stepped inside. She wasn't dressed like the others. No designer gown, no statement jewelry, no glossy finish to signal status. Just a simple black dress, comfortable but unremarkable. It hung a little loose on her slender frame, creased and travel-worn from a 20-hour flight straight from Singapore. Her hair, once neatly tied, had begun to rebel, soft wisps framing her tired face. The dark circles under her eyes hinted at sleepless nights and back-to-back meetings. She hadn't even stopped at her hotel. She had come directly from the airport, carrying only a small bag, which she now tucked quietly beside the host's stand. She didn't arrive to be seen. She arrived to be on time. "I believe Antonio is expecting me," she said softly. The host raised an eyebrow, taking her in with a glance that barely hid his skepticism. In a place where appearance meant everything, Margaret looked like an outlier. To many, she was already dismissed. But while others saw a woman out of place, Margaret wasn't here to prove anything. She didn't care about impressing anyone. She had chosen comfort over presentation, and that silent choice would soon challenge every assumption in the room. At the center of the Sterling Room sat Richard Harrington, a man whose name carried weight in Manhattan's most elite circles. He wore his power like a tailored suit, which, incidentally, he had in abundance. Tonight's was charcoal gray, custom-made in Seville Row, paired with a watch worth more than most people's annual salary. Every movement was calculated, every smirk rehearsed. Around him sat his usual entourage, men dressed just as sharply, women polished to perfection, hanging on his every word like disciples at the feet of their prophet. Richard didn't just thrive in high society. He fed on it, not through charm or grace, but through a cruel game he had mastered over the years: public humiliation. With a sharp wit and sharper tongue, he delighted in cutting people down just enough to get a laugh, but not enough to seem openly cruel. It was always delivered with a smile, always just light enough for others to laugh along without feeling guilty. The nervous waiter, the confused tourist, the retail clerk who stumbled over her words. Each one had been a trophy in Richard's growing collection. And now, his attention had shifted to Margaret. He spotted her across the room as the host led her to her table. His gaze flicked over her plain black dress, her tired face, the worn edges of her shoes. To him, she didn't belong here, and that was all the invitation he needed. He leaned back, lifted his wine glass, and with just enough volume to ensure half the room could hear, he said, well, looks like someone got lost on the way to the diner down the street. His companions burst into knowing laughter. A few nearby diners smirked behind raised menus or wine glasses. The script was familiar, and Richard played it well. But what happened next wasn't part of the script. Margaret, settling into her seat, didn't flinch. She didn't laugh it off or pretend she hadn't heard. She simply looked up, found Richard's eyes across the room, and held his gaze. There was no fear in her expression. No scum, just calm awareness. Like someone who had weathered far greater storms than the sneer of a bored millionaire. And in that brief, unblinking moment, something shifted. Richard had launched his attack, expecting a familiar dance of dominance. But this time, he wasn't facing a target. This time, the predator had chosen the wrong prey. The waiter approached Margaret's table with a practiced smile, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He was young, likely new, and had clearly noticed the tension already unfolding. As he looked at Margaret, her travel-worn dress, the absence of designer accessories, the carry-on tucked by her feet, he instinctively reached for the more affordable suggestion. Perhaps Madam would prefer our prix-fixe option this evening, he offered gently, avoiding any mention of the chef's tasting menu. The most luxurious and expensive selection on the list. Margaret didn't even glance up. The full tasting menu, please, she said simply, her tone calm, decisive. And sparkling water. I'll decide on the wine after I speak with Antonio. The waiter paused, visibly thrown off. The mention of the owner's name brought a momentary shift in his posture, an acknowledgement of something he hadn't expected, but he nodded respectfully and stepped away. Richard, of course, caught every word, and he wasn't about to let it go. From across the room, he let out a sharp laugh, louder than before. This time, more diners looked up. Better check your credit limit first, honey, he called out. That menu costs more than your entire outfit. The remark hung in the air like a challenge. A few chuckles echoed from nearby tables. This was part of the Sterling Room's unspoken tradition, the casual takedown of the outsider. The elite didn't just eat here, they performed here. And right now, Richard was center stage. But Margaret didn't rise to meet his performance. She took a slow sip of her water, eyes still calm, expression unchanged. I'm sure I'll manage, she replied softly. Her poise was unsettling. No panic, no defensiveness, just a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. That only irritated Richard further. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing toward her with exaggerated flair, inviting the whole room to join in the spectacle. Let me guess, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Big night out? Once-in-a-lifetime splurge. Tourist bucket list, maybe. The laughter grew. His companions leaned in, enjoying the show. This was what Richard loved. Dominance disguised as humor. Cruelty served with a smile. But Margaret didn't bite. She placed her napkin gently on her lap, adjusted it with deliberate care, and replied with just 2 words. Just hungry. That was it. But somehow that answer cut deeper than anything Richard had said. Around them, the room grew quieter. Some diners still smiled, but others were beginning to watch with a different kind of interest, not in Richard's performance, but in the woman who refused to play along. The room had taken on a new kind of stillness. Conversations dimmed, wine glasses were set down without sipping, and more than a few phones tilted subtly toward Margaret's table, just in case this turned into something worth capturing. Richard, sensing that he had full command of the room, rose from his chair with calculated grace. Wine glass in hand, he sauntered over to Margaret's table, his smile wide and false. He leaned in slightly, just enough to make the intrusion feel personal. I'm just trying to save you from embarrassment, he said, voice laced with faux concern. This place has standards, you know. Doesn't it feel a bit aspirational for someone like you? The words landed hard. A few diners chuckled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably. The weight of his arrogance pressed against the walls of the restaurant. Margaret didn't move. She looked up at him slowly, eyes steady, lips calm. "Someone like me?" she repeated. There was no edge in her voice, no defensiveness, just quiet curiosity. Her tone wasn't confrontational, it was analytical, like she was examining something under glass. Then she asked, simply, "And you're the arbiter of quality?" A subtle shift occurred, in her voice, in her posture, in the atmosphere itself. The exhaustion that had clung to her like a second skin seemed to fall away. Her shoulders straightened. Her eyes, moments ago dulled by fatigue, now carried a piercing clarity. It was as if the woman Richard had been mocking had disappeared, and someone else entirely had taken her place. Richard blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but not enough to stop. He turned to the surrounding tables, giving a half shrug as if to say, "Can you believe this?" "I don't need to be," he replied smugly. "Quality announces itself." Just like he waved a hand to her direction. Its opposite. A few quiet laughs followed, but they were less certain now. The lines were starting to blur. The charm in his cruelty had begun to crack. Margaret folded her hands on the table, her gaze never leaving his. She didn't respond immediately, and that silence unsettled him more than any retort might have. Around the room, glances were exchanged. The staff paused in their work. The entertainment was no longer entertaining. It was uncomfortable. No longer a joke at the expense of a stranger, but something more serious, more personal. Richard, still convinced of his control, leaned in just a bit closer. "I'm doing you a favor," he said. "Places like this eat little strays like you alive." But this time, before he could finish, Margaret spoke. Her voice was low, but it carried. "Why don't you, Mr. Harrington?" She said his name, clearly, deliberately. The effect was immediate. The room seemed to stop breathing, and for the first time that night, Richard didn't have a comeback. Richard stood there, still holding his wine glass like a prop, his smirk beginning to falter. He had spent years perfecting this act, finding the perfect target, delivering the perfect jab, soaking in the validation of a room that always seemed eager to laugh along. But tonight was different. He opened his mouth to fire another shot, to finish what he started, when Margaret's voice cut cleanly through the tension. "Is public humiliation always your opening move?" she asked, her tone calm but unmistakably firm. "Or am I getting special treatment tonight?" The words landed with a silence louder than anything Richard had said all night. Every fork froze. Every glass hovered midair. Even the background music seemed to fade, as if the entire restaurant was now tuned into a single frequency, hers. Richard blinked. His smile, once so confident, now hung awkwardly on his face. This wasn't going the way he had planned. Margaret kept her gaze locked on him, unflinching. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. There was something in her tone that commanded attention. A quiet strength that didn't beg for the room. It claimed it. "I make it my business to know the regulars," she added, her eyes steady. "And I know exactly who you are." And just like that, the dynamic flipped. Richard's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had assumed she was nobody, a random woman who wandered into the wrong place. But now he wasn't so sure. The laughter stopped. The whispers shifted. All around them, the atmosphere transformed. What had started as a performance for Richard's ego was now something else entirely. He had come looking for a moment of dominance. Instead, he found himself standing on uncertain ground, face to face with someone who wasn't intimidated because she knew something he didn't. And for the first time that evening, Richard Harrington realized he was no longer in control. Margaret sat still, composed, her eyes never leaving Richard's. The room was silent now, every diner holding their breath, caught in the tension hanging between them. Then, with a quiet clarity that cut through the stillness like glass, she said just one word. "Antonio." It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But it didn't have to be. Across the restaurant, a distinguished man looked up sharply from his conversation. His posture straightened. His expression changed in an instant, from the composed poise of a successful owner to the immediate concern of someone recognizing someone important. Deeply important. "Margaret," he called, abandoning his table mid-sentence. Heads turned again, this time toward him. Antonio, the owner of the Sterling Room, moved quickly across the floor. He didn't stroll. He didn't pause. He came with urgency and purpose. When he reached her table, he didn't greet her with the rehearsed charm of a maitre d'. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his face softening into genuine affection. "What is happening here?" he asked, looking from Margaret to Richard, confusion quickly turning into a deeper understanding. Margaret looked up at him, her expression calm but edged with a quiet hurt. "This gentleman," she said softly, "was explaining your restaurant standards. Apparently, I don't meet them." Antonio's face changed again, this time to something colder, something sharper. A protective fury began to rise behind his eyes as he turned fully to face Richard. The room remained silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. This wasn't a performance anymore. It was the moment the curtain dropped, and everyone realized the woman they dismissed was someone worth remembering. Antonio's hand remained firmly on Margaret's shoulder, a quiet but unmistakable gesture of protection. His eyes locked onto Richard's with a calm, simmering fury that didn't need to be loud to be felt. "You were speaking of standards," Antonio said, his voice low but carrying through the room like a warning. To her, Richard shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of his footing. "It was just a bit of harmless." "There is nothing harmless about disrespect in my establishment," Antonio interrupted, his accent sharpening with each word. "Especially not to this woman." He turned slightly toward the room, his voice rising now, not in anger, but in reverence. "Do you have any idea who Margaret Walker is?" The name echoed across the dining room, and diners leaned in. The same woman they had judged minutes ago now stood at the center of something much greater. Antonio didn't wait for Richard to respond. He didn't need to. "This woman," he said, "helped my children get through college. She sat at our Thanksgiving table for the last 15 years. When my wife Lucia dreamed of opening her art gallery and no bank would help her, it was Margaret who believed in her, who funded it, who stood by her side." Richard's face had turned pale. "She taught my daughter Sophia to play the piano. When we faced hard times, it was Margaret who guided us through them. Her wisdom, her heart, her strength. This family owes her more than I could ever repay." The room was utterly still now. There was no smirking, no whispering, just a heavy, collective silence as every person there began to understand the gravity of what they'd witnessed. Antonio's voice dropped, thick with emotion. "The woman you mocked for her simple dress has built schools in her hometown. She's helped thousands, quietly, without fanfare, without needing to prove anything to anyone." He stepped forward, closer to Richard. "She has done more good in this world than you will in 10 lifetimes. And in that moment, the truth was laid bare, not just about Margaret, but about the man who had tried to diminish her. And the difference between wealth and worth had never been clearer." Antonio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With a calm authority that left no room for discussion, he turned toward a discreet earpiece in his ear and spoke a single word. "Security." Almost instantly, 2 sharply dressed men appeared at Richard's side. They didn't speak. They didn't make a scene. Their presence was enough. Richard looked around, as if expecting someone to speak up for him. A lifeline, a laugh, anything. But now, the same people who had chuckled at his jokes just moments earlier avoided his gaze. They shifted in their seats, looked down at their plates, suddenly embarrassed by their own silence. Antonio stood tall, his voice firm and measured. "Mr. Harrington is no longer welcome at the Sterling Room," he said clearly, so that every person in the restaurant could hear, "nor at any establishment in my family's network." Richard stammered, "You can't be serious." "I can," Antonio said without hesitation. "And I am. This place isn't just a restaurant. It's my family's legacy. And in my family, we know the difference between wealth and worth." Then, without even looking at Richard again, he added one final instruction to his staff. "Through the kitchen. He doesn't deserve to use our front door." And just like that, the once proud Richard Harrington, the man who measured his power by how many people he could belittle, was led away, not in glory, but through the back corridors of the very place he once ruled. The laughter had stopped. The room was quiet now, not because it had to be, but because everyone knew they just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. As the doors to the kitchen swung shut behind Richard, the energy in the Sterling room slowly shifted. The tension dissolved, replaced by a hum of realization. Conversations didn't resume right away. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet clink of silverware being gently set down, the occasional breath held just a second too long. Antonio turned back to Margaret, his expression softening from the righteous fire of a protector to the warmth of an old friend. "Forgive me," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "Had I known you were coming tonight, I would have been waiting at the door. Lucia will be furious she missed you." Margaret smiled, her face finally relaxing, the weariness of the day giving way to something gentler. "I came straight from the airport," she said. "Didn't want to miss Sophia's recital tomorrow." And that was when it happened. It started with a single pair of hands clapping from the far side of the room, then another, and another, until the entire restaurant, patrons, servers, even the sommelier frozen mid-pour, broke into spontaneous applause. It wasn't for drama. It wasn't for scandal. It was for dignity, for the woman who had walked in quietly, worn and unadorned, and reminded everyone in that room what true presence looked like. Not wealth, not power, but grace, strength, integrity. Margaret nodded softly in acknowledgement, never standing to take a bow, never basking in attention. That wasn't her style. She didn't need to prove herself. The people around her now understood what Richard never had. She had never needed to dress the part. She was the part. 3 days later, Richard Harrington stood alone in his luxury penthouse overlooking Central Park. The lights of the city sparkled below, but he barely noticed. His phone buzzed constantly, notifications piling up faster than he could open them. Videos from that night at the Sterling room had gone viral. At least a dozen diners had captured it all. The insults, the mockery, the quiet dismantling of his ego, and finally, his humiliating walk of shame through the kitchen. Now, he wasn't Richard Harrington, hedge fund king. He was rich bully. The internet didn't hold back. Comments flooded in from strangers, former colleagues, even people who claimed to have been humiliated by him before. Finally, someone stood up to him. "This guy made my sister cry when she waited on him. Been waiting for years for someone to put him in his place." His publicist sent a message. "We cannot repair this. Strongly advise complete media blackout. We'll call tomorrow to discuss exit strategy." Exit strategy, as if he were a failed business deal. Across town, the world looked very different. In a modest backyard surrounded by trees and the smell of grilled food, laughter echoed through the warm afternoon air. Children ran barefoot across the grass, chasing one another in fits of joy. Adults gathered around picnic tables, balancing paper plates filled with barbecue, potato salad, and homemade lemonade. Margaret stood by the grill in jeans and a soft blue blouse, relaxed and smiling. A beer in one hand, a pair of tongs in the other, she laughed with Antonio, who was flipping burgers like a seasoned chef. There was no mention of the Sterling room, no retelling of what had happened. No one needed to bring up Richard. This gathering wasn't about proving anything. It was about what mattered. In the background, Antonio's youngest daughter taught Margaret's grandchildren how to play volleyball. Lucia passed out slices of peach pie, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret looked like she was home. Antonio leaned over and lowered his voice. "Singapore went well." Margaret nodded, eyes soft with satisfaction. 5 million people will have access to clean water by next year. Every minute of that flight was worth it. And that was the real story. Not the viral clip, not the downfall of a man who built his image on belittling others, but the quiet legacy of a woman who never needed attention to make a difference. Because while Richard's empire crumbled under the weight of public shame, Margaret's impact stretched quietly across the globe. One act of kindness, one project, one life at a time. In the end, the story of Margaret Walker isn't about revenge or viral justice. It's about something deeper, something far more lasting. It's a reminder that true power doesn't come from designer suits, expensive watches, or the ability to control a room with fear. Real power comes quietly. It shows up in kindness, in grace under pressure, in the strength to stand tall when others try to push you down. It lives in the people who know their worth, even when the world tells them they don't belong. Margaret never needed to shout. She never needed to prove herself with wealth or status. Her life, her actions, her quiet confidence spoke louder than anything Richard Harrington could say. And when it mattered most, her character did what money never could. It changed the room. It changed minds. It revealed truth. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated? Judged by how you looked, where you came from, or what you wore? Have you ever stood up for someone who was being pushed aside, even when it wasn't easy? If you have, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. Let's build a community where people are seen for who they are, not for the labels they wear. A space where dignity, compassion, and quiet strength are celebrated. And if this story moved you, even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. Because every week, we share stories that remind us of something this world too often forgets. That the most powerful people in any room aren't always the ones making the most noise. When telling Margaret's story aloud, the delivery is just as important as the words. This isn't just a tale about a wealthy man and a quiet woman. It's about how dignity can disarm arrogance, how character can outshine status, and to bring that to life for your audience the way you tell it matters. Start with a steady, calm tone to build the scene. Let the atmosphere breathe. The Sterling room should feel rich, exclusive, untouchable. But when Richard's voice cuts in, shift the tone. Sharpen it. Let the mockery land uncomfortably, because it should. He's not just being arrogant. He's showing us who he is. Then pause. Let your listeners sit in the silence, just like the restaurant guests did. And when Margaret finally speaks, "Mock me again." Let those words land with weight. Say them slowly. Give them space. That moment is everything. It flips the script. It tells your listeners that something is about to change. As the story unfolds, keep alternating between calm, thoughtful narration and dialogue that reflects the character's emotions. When Antonio arrives, let the warmth come through your voice. When he turns to Richard and says, "Do you know who Margaret Walker is?" Slow it down. Let it hit. That's not just a question. It's the moment the story turns. And through it all, emphasize the contrast. Richard's arrogance is loud, performative, brittle. Margaret's strength is quiet, unwavering, deeply rooted. Highlight that difference with your delivery. Don't rush. Let the emotions simmer, especially in the quiet moments. Those are the ones your listeners will remember. Because in the end, this story isn't about drama for drama's sake. It's about truth. And when told with care, with the right pauses, the right tone, and a steady respect for its message, it becomes more than just a story. It becomes a mirror, a reminder that the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. And sometimes, the most powerful line in the whole story is the one whispered, not shouted. Mock me again. Let that echo.